spiel to begin with anyway. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Camino Pilgrim Confraternity of St James, Constance Storrs lecture of 2025. We're delighted to welcome so many of you here to this interesting talk on where is the body of St James? Rival claims to the relics of St James the Apostle in the Middle Ages. And having recently been to Santiago, that would be, I'm interested to learn what Mike's going to tell us all about it. That we will be here for approximately an hour this afternoon, and there will be time for questions at the end, which you can send in via the chat box or wait until the end of the talk and then hit the raise hand button. Everyone will be muted for the duration of Mike's talk. So please save up your questions or just type them in at the bottom. This talk is named after a lady of great significance to the CSJ in its early years. Constance Mary Storrs was an academic whose MA thesis of Jacobean pilgrims from England to St James of Compostela from the early 12th to the late 15th century inspired a renaissance in pilgrim study in the late 20th century. The thesis was published in book form, first by the Junta de Galicia and then by the CSJ, and is still available in our shop and library. Although Constance sadly passed away not long after the CSJ came into being, we remember her great legacy that has been built upon by our members ever since. So this year's speaker is Mike Sibly. He was a civil servant and then a university administrator and was Deputy Registrar of Oxford University until he retired in 2015. He is now an Emeritus Fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, and he's a graduate of Cambridge University, where he read history, and has taught in adult education over a long period, both in London and Oxford, and has previously led study tours to southwest France in the Languedoc region and Spain, focusing on the medieval history of these areas. He walked the route to Compostela in 2016 to 2018, beginning at Le Puy, and has been a member of the CSJ since before he set off. And in partnership with his late father, W.A. Sibly, he has published translation of 2 medieval chronicles associated with the history of the Catholic heresy and the Albigensian Crusade in southern France. So without further ado, please welcome Mike. Please take to the microphone.
Right, thank you all very much. Can you all hear me and see me? I hope you can. Right, well, thanks very much for joining us as well, and good afternoon. The title of this talk is Where is the Body of St James? Was meant to draw attention to the fact that there is, of course, the claim of Santiago de Compostela in northwest Spain, in Galicia, with which we're all familiar, but there are also other claims. And indeed, I first became interested in this because my first encounter with somewhere claiming to have some of the relics of St James the Apostle was actually Toulouse, not Compostela. And that was about 35 years ago, and I didn't follow it up at the time. But more recently, I've done so, and what you're going to hear in the next 55 minutes or so is the outcome of such investigations as I've been able to do. I would say right at the beginning, I'm not trying to undermine the claims of Compostela at all, or anywhere else for that matter. Not trying to debunk anything. I'm just trying to observe what we find when we look at the evidence. And as I say, follow up that first encounter in Toulouse. That's the purpose. Now, a summary of what I'm going to try and cover this afternoon is as follows, and I've put it up there. I'll be using these slides as we go along, partly to kind of summarize what I'm trying to say to help you follow it, and also to be able to show you pictures and some maps. The first point, the traditional story, which I'll recap for us very briefly, with which most of us are familiar. The point is that was quite slow to develop. And during the earlier Middle Ages, certainly until the middle of the 12th century, the Christian rulers of northern Spain, of Asturias, Galicia, Cantabria, were probably more interested in the relics of other saints than they were in the relics of St James. And I'll be mentioning their interest and how that can be seen today. The results of it can be seen today in 2 places, which I'm very fond of, Oviedo and Leon. And then we'll look at some of these so-called rival claims to St James at other places in Western Europe, and also some of the similar stories about other saints that I'll mention, because St James is not alone in being a saint or an apostle whose body, or at least some of whose remains, is said to remain to survive in various places. We'll look at St James and his relics in France, and in particular at the city of Toulouse in southwest France, in Languedoc, and above all the Basilica of Saint-Sernin down there, which is a very important pilgrim church. We'll also look at Reading Abbey in Berkshire, founded in the early 1120s by King Henry I, which also claimed to have an important relic of St James the Apostle. And we'll also stand back a little bit and look at why saints' relics were important, why saints were powerful, why did people want to have their relics, and then we'll also look at the way in which relics were traded, were moved around, and the way in which multiple claims to relics arose, because, as I say, it's quite a common thing. And finally, we'll try and look at how and why the claims of Compostela won out, how they became prevalent. And that will require us to look very briefly at some of the wider history of medieval Spain and of Western Europe. Now, that's quite an ambitious programme for the next less than an hour, and I'll need to proceed quite briskly. The aim is that we should have time for question and answer when I've finished, but I'll proceed without question until I've completed what I would like to try and say. So, without further ado, having summarised what I'm going to do, where are the bones? Where is the body of St James? Well, they're there, aren't they? Behind that wonderful Baroque 18th century facade at the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, the Praza del Obradoiro. And many of us who are watching will have been there, some of us several times. The traditional story, there's a nice little picture there, which I think I got from Astorga, but I haven't been able to track it down, which kind of shows the body of St James in a boat. And the established story is that after his martyrdom, probably around 44 AD in Palestine, St James's body was miraculously made its way by sea, either in a boat like that or possibly contained within a stone sarcophagus. It was washed ashore on the shores of Galicia in northwest Spain, covered in cockle shells, which is, as most of you will know, why the cockle shell is the symbol of St James. There were various adventures when it had landed, involving a local queen Lupa, encounters with possibly with a dragon, with some rather ferocious bulls. But the outcome was that St James's body was buried in Galicia and appears to have been forgotten about for about 800 years, 750, 800 years. And it was then rediscovered probably sometime in the 820s AD, so a long time after that voyage. And the local Bishop Theodomir of Iria Flavia and his overlord, King Alfonso II of the Christian Kingdom of Asturias, which was based on Oviedo, they built a small chapel at what's now Santiago de Compostela. And that was the beginnings of the cult. And from that traditional, as it were, story, there we have the shrine today with the wonderful visage of St James staring at us as we approach the high altar in the cathedral at Compostela. So that's the established story, which drives so many people, which encourages so many people to visit Compostela. When did this story first develop? It's quite slow, as I've said. There is no record of any cult of St James in Spain at all until the late 6th, early 7th century. And at that time, during the 7th century, that's the 600s AD, the idea that St James might have preached in Spain gained some currency. People in Western Europe, a long way from the Holy Land, where most of the apostles did much of their work, are always very keen on the idea that an apostle might have made it further west. And obviously Peter and Paul made it to Rome, but there's no real early evidence of any apostles coming further west, although, as some of you may know, some apostles went further east, most famously St Thomas to India. But the idea that St James may have evangelized the far western end of the Roman world gained some currency in the 7th century. This rediscovery of his body probably in the 820s under the Asturian King Alfonso II, who I mentioned already, and the local bishop Theodomir. That was really an important stage in this. And I'll mention later on that this wasn't the only body of an important saint to be miraculously rediscovered after a long period of neglect and obscurity. And we'll come along across this idea of the finding of saints' bodies, the inventio, as it's called in Latin, as we go through. But really, this was quite a slow thing to develop. And the belief that St. James was buried in Spain only begins to spread thereafter, rather than just having evangelized there. The idea that he was actually buried in Spain is a development really of the 9th century, the late 8th, 9th century, and very much promoted by the Asturian kings. So a few details on this next slide, which needn't detain us long. A quotation there from a monk writing in the monastery in Paris in the mid-9th century. St. James's most holy remains were translated from Jerusalem to Spain and deposited in its remotest region. And he's one of the earliest written records of St. James being venerated in Galicia. And again, as some of you may know, the first attested pilgrim, the first one we know about from written records from outside Spain, from outside Iberia, was a bishop of Le Puy in what's now eastern France around 950. So quite late in some ways. But importantly, the cult of St. James in Galicia was limited and local to begin with, and the story of his presence in the presence of his relics in northwest Spain only develops very slowly until at least 1100. And what I'd like to do now is explore this point in a bit more detail and look at two things. Firstly, briefly to summarize the political context for all this. What was going on in Spain at this time? What were the politics behind all this? And secondly, look at the way in which, as I've mentioned, the Asturian kings, the Christian rulers in the far north, were in many ways more interested in other saints, not in St. James. Why was that? What was going on? So briefly, the political context. As many of you will know, post-Roman Spain was ruled by an elite of Visigothic aristocrats who overran it in the 5th century, but and they established a really quite sophisticated Christian kingdom in the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigothic kingdom. But in 711, there was an Arab-led, largely Berber invasion of the peninsula, which very quickly knocked out the Visigothic elite. And by the 720s and 730s, they'd overrun and taken control of most of Iberia. And that's an attempt to summarize, roughly speaking, what things looked like around 750. And you can see the Umayyad Caliphate, which is based in Damascus, at that point is the ultimate sort of exercising ultimate overlordship of most of Iberia. But in the far north, you've got a couple of surviving Christian enclaves, the Kingdom of Asturias, based on Oviedo, which runs through in the east towards Cantabria. And then you've got the Kingdom of the Basques, who are quite different and have always been different and always will be different and are different, right up there in what's still the Basque country. Note on the right in red, the Balearic Islands are under Byzantine, Eastern Roman control at that point. The Muslims hadn't yet quite overtaken it. There are Christians surviving in the north. Over the next 150, 200 years, the Christian kingdoms in the north, for various reasons, begin to try and extend their control a little bit. And that map tries to summarize this. And you can see at the top Asturias and Cantabria in the green, and beginnings of an extension of the control of the kings of Asturias westwards into Galicia, south of the mountains into Leon, cities like old Roman cities like Astorga and Leon, and very gradually in the later 9th century into the northern side of the Douro Valley, down to the Douro River, you know, Zamora, Toro, and places like that. But that expansion is quite modest and quite slow. Takes over quite a long period. But the interest of the Asturian kings in Santiago de Compostela is part of their attempts to extend their influence westwards into Galicia, which is a separate kingdom for much of this period. And they're interested in associating themselves with this miraculous discovery of an apostle's body. And it gives them prestige, gives them power, and helps extend their political control. So that association of, as it were, patronage of and patronage from a prestigious saint with political control is really quite important. And we'll probably hear a little bit more about that shortly. And I think that the takeaway point, the simple point, is that control of relics is associated with power and prestige. And that's what gets the Asturian kings interested in becoming patrons of this new shrine of St James in Compostela. However, for much of this early period, right up until the early 1100s, they're much more interested in other saints, and in particular, saints from the former Visigothic south. Now, I've mentioned the Visigothic kingdom already. It was a powerful, sophisticated, and important kingdom, and the memory of it persists in the north. There's a long story around all that, which I can't go into now. And until, as I've summarized there, until the 12th century, the kings in the north, the Christian kings in Asturias, Leon, were mainly interested in rescuing saints' remains from the Muslim south. And they negotiate for the return of a number of saints' bodies. They have a particular interest in two sets of saints or martyrs. One is the later Roman saints who were patronized by the Visigothic Church and whose bodies are located at various points in what's at this point the Muslim South. And they're also interested in the remains of a small group of martyrs who effectively provoked their Muslim overlords in Cordoba in the middle of the 9th century and got themselves martyred. And these slightly later martyrs are of interest to the kings of Asturias in the north. And I'll just give you two examples of the way in which these the remains of these saints from the south, from the Muslim south, are transferred north by looking at, firstly, Oviedo, which some of you may be familiar with, the capital of the Kingdom of Asturias in the far north, the starting point for the first Camino, the Camino from Oviedo to Santiago, which is known today as the Camino Primitivo. And so the cathedral in Oviedo, and we'll look at that. And then secondly, Leon, south of the mountains, on the current Camino Frances, and again, many of you will be familiar with that. So if we look at Oviedo, there's a picture of the cathedral, mainly a 14th century thing, and as I said already, a starting point for the Camino Primitivo and capital of the early Kingdom of Asturias. Some of the saints whose bodies you can find there now, or relics you can still find there. I've just listed them there. Two early ones, Leocadia and Eulalia from Merida in the south, and their remains are transferred north by some of these early Christian kings. And then the third one in bold there is Eulogius, who's one of these Cordoban martyrs from the mid-9th century. And there's another one associated with him, Leocritia. And if you go to the cathedral in Oviedo today, you will find not particularly well displayed the relics of some of these people, and in particular, there's a really impressive Romanesque chamber, or Camara Santa, the Holy Chamber, which is to the let me think, is southwest of the main church, and you need to go up some quite steep steps to get to it. But it's got some wonderful Romanesque carving in it, and within that Camara Santa, all sorts of relics which were housed in Oviedo, and which are prized by the rulers of Asturias. And these pictures which I took are not particularly good, but you can see there's a sort of processional cross on the left, and various reliquaries or caskets that are used to hold relics on the right. And then there's a close-up there of the relics of the two Cordoban martyrs, Eulogius and Leocritia, which was given by Alfonso VI in 1075, using Moorish silver from the south. Nice elaborate work. And if you go down into the crypt underneath, just off the cloisters, you'll find some other sarcophagi, some tombstones from some of these other martyrs. So that's Oviedo. No sign of St James at all. It's other saints that the Asturian kings are interested in. And then when they move their capital further south to Leon, there's the Basilica of San Isidoro in Leon, which houses the relics of the very eminent Visigothic churchman, St Isidore of Seville in the south, which were transferred up here in the late 10th, early 11th, I think it's the early 11th century, in fact. And if you visit Leon now and go into the building, you'll see that wonderful Pantheon, which was built as late as the 1060s under King Ferdinand of Leon and Castile and his queen, to house their bodies. And that's all dedicated to St Isidore. And as you can say, that's middle of the 11th century, and remained the kind of burial place of the kings of Leon, Castile for a while. So that's Leon and Oviedo. And meanwhile, we've got St James over in Asturias, but all the attention, sorry, in Galicia, but the attention in Oviedo, in Leon, is very much on the saints that I've just been running through. And meanwhile, other claims to have parts of the body of the Apostle James grew up all over Western Europe. And I've listed there just a few examples. The Holy Roman Empire, which is, I guess, modern Germany, Saint-Denis, north of Paris, Aachen, Charlemagne's capital in what's now Western Germany, and our very own Reading, which during the 1120s acquired a hand of St James, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. Often these relics are said to be gifts from Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor from the early 9th century. And St James, as I've hinted at already, is not the only apostle or indeed saint who is the subject of competing or rival or multiple claims. And the most famous example to people who sort of study this kind of thing is the account by an early 12th century churchman called Gilbert de Nogent, when he's wrestling with the problem that there appear to be two heads of John the Baptist. Which one is genuine? And so anyway, he talks about that. So in a sense, the multiplication of all these claims reflects the importance of saints in 11th, 12th, 13th century culture. I've already suggested that being associated with possession of a saint's relics improves your power and your prestige. Well, multiplication of claims reflects the growing importance of saints in contemporary society. And there's just an example of some of the rival claims that you get in France. And I got that map off the internet, so I'm grateful to whoever prepared it. You can't see the detail, I don't think, but there's a lot of them, aren't there? There's quite a lot of them, and the one I always like is the one which looks like a sort of hairy asterisk, which is, you can see the key on the left. It says Poil de Barbe. That's some of the beard, the hairs from the beard of St James, and I think you find them up at a place called Saint-Algy up in the northeast of France. But you can see from just this very quick look at this map that all over what's now France, there are places which claim to have bits of St James the Apostle. So these claims multiply. And the question is, why were saints and their relics important? A huge subject which we can only glance at today, but it's important to have some appreciation of this to get a sense of why rival claims to St James's body arose. And essentially, most interest is paid to the remains of the apostles or of early martyrs and early saints. There are some, as it were, new saints who emerge, most famously perhaps Thomas Becket at Canterbury. But by and large, the name of the game is to gain possession of all or bits of earlier saints, especially preeminently one of the 12 apostles who are much sought after. And what do saints do? What do their relics do? Well, they intercede on our behalf directly with Jesus and with God. Very important intercessory powers, and that power of intercession, of talking on our behalf to Jesus or God, becomes very important as doctrines about the afterlife and above all purgatory emerge. Purgatory, as many of you will know, in the medieval Catholic Church develops as a doctrine, is a kind of holding place, a kind of interim house between heaven or hell on the one hand and this life on the other. And how long you spend in purgatory is determined by how sinful you were and how well you managed to atone for your sins in this life. And getting a saint to intercede on your behalf will reduce the time you have to spend in purgatory. And as those ideas develop, so the importance of saints interceding on our behalf also develops. And then, of course, there's also the Last Judgment, with Christ presiding over all of us and determining whether we go ultimately after purgatory to heaven or hell. So a whole powerful range of ideology, of ideas, of thinking around the way in which saints can help us in that sense, in terms of our afterlife. Also, saints can intercede in the here and now, either directly or by invoking the help of Jesus or even of God. And they can help us in all kinds of ways. One thing is that they're important in swearing oaths. You swear oaths on saints' relics. They can help you if you're a ruler or an aristocrat in battle. And St James, as we'll see before I finish, has an important role helping the kings of Asturias and the kings of Leon and Castile in their battles. And there also, I've given the example there of the Holy Lance from the First Crusade at Antioch in 1098. That's another very well-known example if you're a devotee of medieval history. The lance which supposedly pierced the side of Christ on the cross is miraculously discovered by the first Crusaders at Antioch on their way to Jerusalem in 1098 and helps them. So relics and saints protect warriors in battle. They help you in battle. Relics and saints have healing powers, and we'll see an example from the relics of St James at Reading later on. And relics are also obviously, in our case, associated with the development of pilgrimage, the idea of going to visit the relics of saints wherever they happen to be placed. And that, as I've suggested already, is connected with the idea of doing something virtuous to atone for your sins, being penitent for your sins. And if you do that, you will hopefully reduce the amount of time you spend in purgatory. So all in all, saints and their relics are valuable, highly prized by kings and by churches, and they bring prestige, and as today, they bring visitors and they bring revenue. So it's win-win all round. I thought one example of the importance of relics in law is from something that's much in the news at the moment, the Bayeux Tapestry, housed in Bayeux in Normandy, giving the story graphically represented of the Norman conquest of England by Duke William. And there's a picture of Harold, later King Harold of England, probably in 1064 if he ever went to Normandy, swearing an oath, allegedly swearing an oath of fealty to King William, who's on the left there wielding his sword, and Harold is there, and he's got both hands on two reliquaries, and he's swearing this oath of loyalty to William, so the tapestry tells us, on relics. And that's, I thought that was just a good way of perhaps remembering the importance of relics in just one example in oath swearing. And if President Macron is foolish enough to allow the Bayeux tapestry to come to England, you'll be able to go and see it yourself. There is, of course, a wonderful late Victorian, I think it's late Victorian replica of the tapestry in the Municipal Museum in Reading. So if you can't make it as far as Bayeux, and you haven't done so far, you can see something that looks pretty much like that in Reading. Good museum in Reading, I would stress. So arising from all these points, the importance of relics and of the saints whose relics they are, a lot of competition to acquire them because they bring power, they bring prestige. So what we find, especially during the 11th, 12th and 13th centuries, but as we saw from the example of Compostela way back in the early 9th century, you get a lot of examples of the semi-miraculous finding, or inventio in Latin, of relics. This is very, very common, and there are lots of examples from all over the Mediterranean and indeed the Western Europe. And the great age of this inventio in the West is really the second half of the 11th century onwards. But it really began with the Emperor Constantine's mother, St Helena, when she made her visit to the Holy Land in the 330s, very early on, and discovered all sorts of extraordinary things like the crown of thorns and bits of the Holy Cross and all this kind of thing, which gets passed down in later centuries and are much sought after. The common elements in these stories of finding relics are some kind of revelatory message. In the case of Compostela, it was a sign to this hermit Pelagius sitting in a field near Compostela, near the burial ground where the body of St James was found in the 820s. But similar revelatory messages come to other people who find the remains of saints. You tend to get older tombs, often Roman ones. Who knows who was buried in them? And usually what happens is miraculously the remains of the saint have been preserved, untainted, undecayed, and there's a sweet smell rather than some foul, pungent smell which emanates from the body. So these stories are very common, and they dovetail with my fourth point there, all sorts of stories of the travels of the apostles and other saints, in order to make it plausible that the body of St James should be in Galicia. Stories were told about how he visited Spain, and these stories get elaborated, and stories about the wanderings and the preaching of saints become very common. And finally, at the bottom of that slide, I've just mentioned two other saints who allegedly did some wandering. St Thomas, that we've already encountered, who went to India, and I think he probably did go to India, and St Andrew, who supposedly went to Scotland. I think that's more doubtful myself, but anyway, who am I to pronounce? So competition for relics is common. People buy and sell them, and as we'll see in a moment, they also steal them. But the point is that they're much sought after. And an example of the theft of relics, which I find particularly interesting, some of you will be familiar with the stories of Ellis Peters, the brother Cadfael stories, and that's a picture of whoever played Cadfael on television. I've forgotten the name of the actor now, but the book's very good. And the first one is called A Morbid Taste for Bones, and it's actually based on a real theft of relics of St Winifred in North Wales in the 1130s. And another example of theft, which I'll just mention briefly, is from somewhere which is on the road to the Pyrenees from Le Puy on the Camino through France, the Chemin de Saint-Jacques, a place called Conques in Aveyron, which if you've not visited it, you have a treat in store. If you have, you'll know that that picture doesn't quite really do justice to the wonderful Romanesque abbey that's at Conques, housing the relics of St Faith, And there she is in all her glory in a rather sort of primitive looking reliquary. And her relics, St Faith's relics, she's an early martyr, was stolen by the monks of Conques in the 9th century from nearby Agen. And there's a big story about all that in a book composed in Conques in the early 11th century. So the theft of relics, people's desire to obtain relics extends as far as theft, and it's known as furta sacra, holy theft. Okay, so that's some sort of background there to summarize, if you like. And against that background of the importance of an interest in saints and their relics, you begin to see why and how rival claims might emerge. And the first example that I want to look at is Toulouse and the relics of St James. Now, I don't know how many of you have visited Toulouse. It's a city which I think is wonderful. We tend in England to associate it with the Airbus, and Concorde, I think, was in the 1960s, was partly built there. And there is indeed a big industry around aerospace in Toulouse, but it's also got a hugely attractive centre. And I'd strongly recommend a visit if you've not been there. And it was an important place in Roman and post-Roman times. It is the focal point, the capital of the province or principality of Languedoc, and it became an important pilgrim centre in its own right. I haven't got time to go into all the details there. But in particular, there's one really attractive and important church there, the Basilica of St Saturninus, Saint-Sernin, St Saturninus, who was an early Christian martyr. And this basilica, it's not a cathedral, but it was built just outside the northern fringes of the old city in the late 11th and early 12th century, and is the model for the Romanesque cathedral at Compostela. And the basilica at Saint-Sernin allegedly houses the relics of 6 apostles. The legend of the hanged pilgrim, which we find now at Santo Domingo de la Calzada, the one with the cocks in the cage in the cathedral, I won't go into the detail, but that actually originated in Toulouse and sort of migrated there. Sue was kind enough to mention my translations of chronicles associated with the Albigensian Crusade. That was focused on Toulouse and Languedoc, and we haven't got time to talk about it now, but it's important. And Toulouse was on one of the main routes to Compostela, which is interesting, the one beginning at Arles over in Provence. And I've given you a little map there to show you the route, which is followed by pilgrims beginning at Arles through Saint-Gilles, across central southern France to Toulouse, and across the Pyrenees at the Col du Samport, rather than the pass at Roncesvalles, which many of us walk over these days. And people still do that route. It's being developed quite well, as some of you will know. And I know 1 or 2 people have done it. So Toulouse is a really important pilgrim centre in its own right in the 11th and 12th centuries. And there's an example of one of our familiar Camino signs at the top there, but also the bilingual street signs in Toulouse, the Occitan language, which is a bit like modern Catalan, and the French, which you find in Toulouse today. So I'm plugging Toulouse because I think it's a nice place to visit. The claims of Toulouse to relics of St James, it's quite confusing and quite confused. And I've summarised the main points there. The claims to have the bodies of both St James the Apostle and St James the Less, that's always a source of great confusion, that there's more than one, at least 2 St Jameses, probably 3 or 4. And claims to have part or all of the bodies of 1 or more of the St Jameses are made by at least 2 churches in Toulouse, the Basilica of Saint-Sernin, which I've mentioned, and also a church which has now been demolished, which was just adjacent to the cathedral in Toulouse, the Church of St James. And there are all sorts of stories about how Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Empire in the early 800s, gave the Basilica of Saint-Sernin in Toulouse the bodies of a whole load of saints, including bits of 6 apostles, no fewer than 6 apostles, including both St James's. minor and major. So that was a story that was current in Toulouse in the Middle Ages. And these claims are particularly well documented for the 15th and the 16th century. I was going to just read you how are we doing for time? We're not too bad. Just read you an example, one from 1385, which I have not put up on there, but it says this is something by an aristocratic visitor to Toulouse in 1385, and he says, on Sunday the 15th of October, in the year 1385, the said Lord came to the church of Saint-Sernin and went to the place where the holy body of St James the Apostle was lying. He took up the head and he kissed it, and he placed 300 gold crowns in the hat, which was on the head, so as to help pay for a new reliquary. So that's 1385. And then in 1494, a German pilgrim, somebody called Jerome Munzer, Toulouse has the body of St James the Less, whose head was once at Compostela. Interesting. In a wonderful reliquary lies the body of St James the Great, and his head is in a silver reliquary decorated with precious stones. A German canon at the church in Toulouse, who came from Switzerland, opened the reliquary in our honour and allowed us to kiss the head of St James. So that's two accounts. There are plenty more of people visiting Toulouse, the Basilica of Saint-Sernin, in the 14th and 15th centuries, to actually venerate the relics of St James, which are supposedly there. And there's also another building in Toulouse, the Pilgrim Hospital of St James across the river, associated with with St James. Now, what people made of the fact that they were en route to Compostela but found the body of St James in Toulouse, I don't know, is the short answer. Perhaps we can come back to that at the end. But these claims clearly coexisted with those of Compostela. And there's a lot more detail behind all that, which we haven't got time to go into. But just a few pictures to round off Toulouse. There is the wonderful Basilica of Saint-Sernin. It's largely Romanesque, and it really is impressive inside. And if we go inside, there's the nave and the wonderful brick and light-coloured stone, a very long nave with two very wide side aisles. And then if you go down into the lower crypt, you have to look quite hard these days to find it. You find there in the shadows is a reliquary, which if you peer closely enough, claims to have the body of St James the Apostle. And there's a bit closer peering, but it's not very obvious, is it? So they kind of keep a bit quiet about it these days. You have to look for it. Because it's, I suppose, an uncomfortable truth that there appear to be these rival claims. But if you do venture into Saint-Sernin, in Toulouse, go down into the lower crypt, you will find that reliquary. And if you peer even closer, you'll see an inscription telling you it's St James. If we go to Reading now, we zoom to Reading, very important abbey in the Middle Ages, as some of you will know, founded in the early 1120s by King Henry I. Associated with the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy, which I'll mention in a moment again. Henry I's daughter, the widowed Empress Matilda, brought back a hand of St James with her to Reading when she came back from Germany in the mid-1120s. And there are all sorts of accounts of the miracles performed by this hand at Reading. I've given you one here, which is a miraculous cure, which is performed by somebody coming to visit the hand of St James at Reading, a woman named Goda, wife of a knight of Herefordshire, grievously ill, almost without hope, sent to Reading for water, which had been associated with the hand of the Blessed James. And when it had been brought, she had herself carried to church so that in the house of the Lord and trusting in the Lord, she could drink the sanctifying liquid. This is the water associated with St James's hand. And when she'd been taken there, she prayed and received the medicine of the sacred water. Scarcely had the water touched and warmed her vitals when it immediately brought about a cure within her. And the pain was removed and the body was revived and her spirit strengthened. So she got up and healed, full of joy and praise. So there's a miracle associated with the presence of the hand of St James in Reading. If you go to Reading today, the abbey ruins have been extensively renovated more recently, but they were very badly mauled, particularly in the 17th century in the Civil Wars, in the English Civil Wars. There's a gateway that was restored in the 19th century, and some of you will be familiar with that, with a horrible office block looming behind it. But it's certainly worth a visit to see the remains of Reading Abbey, even though it's nothing like it used to be. And there is the hand. Quite a number of you watching, I know, will have seen that. It's now, it was rediscovered in the middle of the 18th century, having been dispersed during Henry VIII's vindictive abolition of the monastery at Reading in the late 1530s. And it eventually passed through, having passed through private hands, as it were, it found its way to St Peter's Church in Marlow, which is where it's now housed. And occasionally it does come back to Reading. I know Robin Dawkins is present today. He arranged for it to be returned to us early this year, and I actually gave a version of this talk with that hand right next to me. So that was quite something. That's the hand of St James from Reading. So despite all that, however, and this is the sort of final section of my talk, despite all that, despite Toulouse, despite all those places in France, despite Reading, all of whose claims continued, the story that we began with at the start of this talk of St James the Apostle's body being in Compostela, it's the one that wins out, as it were, and becomes most well known in popular consciousness. And it's the one that becomes the focal point for the pilgrimage in the late 11th and 12th and 13th centuries, and which has been so well revived in the last 30, 40 years. I've just got a picture up there from a manuscript known as the Codex Calixtinus, or Book of St James, and that's something that was produced in the 1130s, early 1140s, probably at Compostela, to promote the pilgrimage to Compostela. And it's part of what can only be described as a kind of extremely effective propaganda campaign to promote Compostela. And some of you may have heard of this already. Contained within this book or codex in book 5 is a kind of mid-12th century pilgrim's guide to how to get to Compostela. And a lot of people have a look at that before they make the journey themselves. I certainly did. And if you've not come across it before, it's worth having a look at. There are many translations, one of which was published by the Confraternity of St James some years ago, and I suspect is still on sale in our shop at the Confraternity. So that's the story that we know, focusing on Compostela, which first gains its kind of familiar form, arguably, in this Codex Calixtinus. And the question is, well, how and why did Compostela win out in the way it did? That's a very long and complex story. And I've only got about 7 or 8 minutes in which to try and tell it to you. But essentially, we need to look wider at the wider history of Western Europe and indeed of Iberia. What happens to enable the cult at Compostela to become so dominant after about 1100? And the first point is to repeat that the rival claims that we've just had a quick look at, they coexist. The discrepancies are not resolved, and most of the time they're just ignored. And the growing prominence to Compostela is due to wider factors, and there are 2 things in particular that I would stress. The first is, and we need to sort of take a deep breath here because it's quite a big point, there's enormous growth and change and energy emanating from Northwest Christian Europe from around the middle of the 11th century, from say the 1050s. Ultimately, it may come down to climate change. We don't quite know, but the population of what's now northeast France, the Rhineland, the Netherlands, Burgundy, and northern Italy all begins to grow in this period, including England. Economic growth, population growth, and one of the outcomes of that is a much wealthier warrior aristocracy and a much wealthier church. And as I said, the powerhouse is those areas together with northern Italy. And this social economic growth, if you like, preeminently finds expression in religious changes. The papacy is energized and makes all sorts of grand claims for itself. We see the Crusades from the 1090s onwards, this enormous explosion of energy of warriors going from Western Europe to try and reconquer the Holy Land, Palestine, from the Muslims. We see the enormous growth in the popularity of pilgrimage. And a very good example would be the kind of explosion of energy out of Normandy, with the Normans not only coming north across the Channel to conquer England, but also going south to conquer southern Italy and Sicily, and also into the Eastern Roman Empire. So this enormous, that's the first point. What we're witnessing in the late 11th century, early 12th century is the powerhouse of Europe, the wealthier part, the culturally strong part with all sorts of new ideas, is that area of, if you like, North and West Europe. And the second point is to bear in mind the changing political context in Spain. And to cut a long story short, and it's a very long story, the Christian kingdoms become increasingly powerful as the Muslim south becomes weaker, and the Caliphate of Cordoba falls to pieces in the 1030s, 1040s, and the Christian kings from the north, in the kingdoms of what are by this time Leon and Castile and Aragon, begin to increase their power further south. And increasingly, they absorb the energy and the influences from north of the Pyrenees, and the pilgrimage to St James and the cult of St James becomes a vehicle for the transmission of that culture. And in particular, we see the growth of the cult of St James in Spain, promoted by the kings of what by this stage has become the Kingdom of Leon and the County of Castile, as part of their consolidation of rule and expansion southwards. A lot of support from the papacy, and is particularly associated with the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy. And again, many of you will have heard of the monastery of Cluny. It has daughter houses all over Western Europe, and indeed the monastery of Reading that we've looked at was founded by Cluniac monks from Lewes Priory in Sussex. And there develops not only the pilgrimage to Compostela, but also this Christian move south, the so-called Reconquista, the reconquest. And it's quite a complicated picture. And St James develops two personalities, if you like. One is Santiago Peregrinus, Santiago the Pilgrim, and the other is Santiago Matamoros, St James the Moor Slayer, the slayer of Muslims, Matamoros. And the final, in particular, point, this big cultural, religious development is associated with the building not only of the cathedral in Compostela, the Romanesque cathedral in Compostela, which we know today, but also the development of an infrastructure for pilgrims. And one man is particularly associated, certainly, with the cathedral, and that's a man called Diego Gelmirez, who is first bishop and then archbishop of Compostela. Now, that is a huge story, and we haven't got time to do it this afternoon, but it's really that which is promoting the pilgrimage. And again, just to finish off briefly, look at the political context. That's the Iberian Peninsula around 900, and you can see the kingdoms in the north there, and the extent of the green, which is the Muslim control, with the semi-independent Muslim principality in the Ebro Valley. By the 1200s, the kingdoms from the north have expanded further south, and you've got the development of the Kingdom of Aragon, and also the origins of what becomes the Kingdom of Portugal, which is initially an offshoot of Leon, and happens to have survived. So big move south of Christian control, and to some extent the reign of Alfonso VI, who died in 1109, is a bit of a turning point, although I think when I was putting this together, I almost put the beginning of a turning point, if you can have one of those. But he's a particularly important monarch, and he's the one who takes over control of Toledo in 1085 from the Muslims, and that used to be the capital of Visigothic Spain. And he gives himself various very elaborate titles: Emperor of the whole of Spain, the most victorious king in Toledo and in Spain and in Galicia. And also, interestingly, gives himself a Muslim title, Emperor of the Two Religions. And to me, that there's an awful lot that one could talk about there. But he promotes the Basilica of St Isidore in Leon that we've looked at already, which was founded by his father. But he also begins to promote big time the pilgrimage to Compostela. And in particular, he is associated with all sorts of influences from Burgundy, both aristocratic. He himself at one point marries the daughter of the Counts of Burgundy and marries off his children to Burgundians. And he also promotes the Cluniac order in northern Spain. And he sends payments he gets in tribute from the Muslim south back to the monastery of Cluny. And one of the interesting things about this period is that quite a lot of the rebuilding of the monastery of Cluny in Burgundy in the late 11th and 12th centuries is actually financed by Arab gold, which originated south of the Sahara in West Africa. Another story. I haven't got time to go into the influence of the papacy and the Cluniacs and the Burgundians in any great detail, but I've mentioned a few points here. I'll need to wrap up in a moment or two. One aspect of this which I find absolutely fascinating is the way in which the popes in Rome are trying to extend their influence and their power in this period. And they want to, above all, impose Roman rituals on the Spanish church. And the Spanish church, the Christian church in Spain at this time, is using the ritual which it had been inherited from the Visigothic period, which had obviously continued under Muslim rule, centered on Toledo. And there is a quotation from Gregory VII, the Pope, who wants to try and persuade Alfonso VI to accept the order and ritual of the Roman Church, not the order and ritual of Toledo or any other. And this attempt to impose a kind of liturgical uniformity on the Spanish Church was associated with the influx of monks and churchmen from elsewhere in Europe. And I've given some details there, which we can't go into, of the way in which the Cluniacs expanded their influence, and also the aristocrats from Burgundy also did. And there's quite a lot of detail that one could go into, but I'll need to press on. I can't resist showing you a picture there of the way in which the Cluniac influence is being tapped into by those who would attract us along the Camino. And that's a picture which I took when I walked that in 2018, coming into a place called Carrion de los Condes in Palencia. And there's a little sign there telling us that it's a Cluniac site, because the monastery of San Zoilo on the western outskirts of Carrion is now a really luxurious hotel, but was a Cluniac monastery, being founded all along the route. And we'll skip that. Finally, Santiago, patron of Reconquista. There's a quotation here which I think is quite important to have a look at, from a 12th century chronicle. And this just is meant to illustrate for you the way in which Santiago, St James, becomes the patron saint of the Christian expansion southwards. And the quotation says, after these, this is all about King Ferdinand I of Leon Castile. After some earlier triumphs, in order that Coimbra, which is now in northern Portugal, might be restored to Christian rule, the king solicitously sought out the shrine of St James the Apostle, whose body, as we know, is said to have been borne to Spain by the divine visitation of our Redeemer. He prayed for 3 days there, that his campaign might yield happy and prosperous results, and pleading that the apostle should be an intercessor for him, should intervene for him with the divine majesty. And then he went off to besiege Coimbra. So that's St James being called, being prayed in aid, being called. And Santiago Matamoros becomes a very important, as it were, incarnation of St James. And there's a lot of detail there which I can't go into at any length. But there's also the bottom point on that slide, the final bullet point. There's a tax that's levied by the Christian kings, which goes to the cathedral at Compostela, the Privilegio del Voto, which begins around the middle of the 12th century. So that's a way in which St James brings a lot of money to the cathedral at Compostela. And there's an embodiment, a statue, a figure of Santiago Matamoros from the cathedral at Compostela. And you can see all those poor Moors, poor Arabs at the bottom, being slaughtered by St James on his wonderful white horse, intervening in battle to help the Christians in their warfare. And I think the bloody picture, the bloody bottom half of that is now covered up with flowers if you go into the cathedral of Compostela, because it's rather, doesn't really fit very well with a lot of modern tastes. Anyway, that's Santiago Matamoros. Final main point, the reality is much more complex than the simple narrative of a gradual Christian conquest might suggest. What's much more important is what you might call realpolitik. Alfonso places his bets very carefully, and as well as bringing in Cluniacs and buying into this legend of Santiago de Compostela and all the rest of it, he also maintains very good relations with the Muslim South. And one of his wives is actually a Muslim who takes the Christian name Isabel, and she becomes the mother of the heir to the throne, who sadly dies before Alfonso VI does, Sancho. So what I'm stressing there is that whatever the narrative, realpolitik is more important than religion. Realpolitik is more important than religion. And there are lots of continuing alliances across Muslim Christian lines. And the Christians fight each other just as much as they fight any Muslims. So this idea of religious warfare needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. The real ideological conflict develops slightly later. And it's not unimportant, but reality is, as always, more complicated than the simple stories would have us believe. Now, we need to rush on. So I was going to show you a picture there of the best example I can give of how reality is more complex, and that's El Cid, who, as we all know, looked remarkably like Charlton Heston, and his wife, Jimena, looked remarkably like Sophia Loren. That's from the film in 1961. Well, El Cid is portrayed as a kind of Christian hero. Far from it. He was an independent mercenary captain who was himself, of course, Christian, but he spent as much time fighting for Muslim powers as he did against them. So he wasn't just a simple Christian hero, but later legend develops the story of him as a kind of Christian hero. But we're left, in my final slide, with St James the Pilgrim, his other incarnation, his relics in Galicia, which we all go and visit. And as I suggested, while the other claims don't go away, they very much take a back seat. Now, I've had to rush through a lot of things there, but I hope you've got some sense of the interesting aspects of this subject. And thank you all, if you're still there, for listening.